Hello everyone, this is the first long form video of my channel. I wanted to go over a little bit of how the US government is funded and the chances of the US defaulting this summer. So first, the government is funded through three main ways. The first is taxes, so that makes up about 60% of its total revenue. The second is in forms of bonds. Essentially, it is individuals, companies, sovereign wealth funds, other countries, whatever, can lend their money to the government in exchange for interest paid on that loan further down the road or in a continuous basis. So essentially, first way is taxes, second way is people lending their money to the government. And then the third way is the lender of last resort, which is the Federal Reserve. So it's a little tricky. The Federal Reserve is not federal and it doesn't actually have reserves. So despite its name, it's a little confusing. They did that on purpose. But ultimately, the Federal Reserve is a private bank without reserves. So if the government can't generate the revenue from taxes and it can't find people or enough people to lend it money for its spending, then it will ultimately go to the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve will lend it money or lend the federal government money. When the Federal Reserve lends money to the government, it's essentially created out of thin air. I mean, it's what we call money printing. I mean, this is very high level overview of how this works. It's a very complicated system, but I don't think it has to always be explained that way. So my hope is to sort of just break this down from a very high level and make it more easy to understand than what it may appear to be on the surface. So those are the three main ways it makes money or it earns revenue. And essentially, the debt ceiling is a limit imposed by Congress on the government in order to keep it in check and to keep it from borrowing too much money. I can throw up a chart of showing you how much debt the U.S. is in and how much it's continuously borrowed over time. So I don't really think this is a very effective way of keeping the U.S. from borrowing more, because ultimately they just keep borrowing more. There's never really been a point where they haven't borrowed more. So it doesn't really work, but that's the intent at least. So the federal government will likely run out of money by June 2023. And essentially what this means is that it's going to hit its limit. It can no longer borrow more money. It can still take the money it receives from taxes, and it just cannot issue out more debt or borrow more debt from people, because it's going to have to pay the debt back and it's going to have to pay the interest back on that debt as well. And so what's likely to happen is that the US will hit the ceiling, and they'll either suspend the ceiling or they will just bump the ceiling up higher, just as they've always done. It's more of political play just to get things passed. I really don't think there's much of a chance that the US actually defaults on the debt. And that's because the amount of the world that uses government debt, the US government debt specifically, to back anything from interbank lending to car loans, it's used all over the world. Not just US banks, international banks use the US's IOU, your money back receipt, as a form of collateral. So essentially, Bank A wants to lend money to Bank B, and so it says, here, in a very simple term, I'll give you my IOU note from the US Fed to you, and that way, if I don't pay my debt obligations back, you can go and cash out from the federal government and they'll give you your money back. So it's a way it uses collateral. The issue is that if the US did actually default on the debt, all that collateral, all of these treasuries, all of these essentially IOUs in the system across the entire world, which is trillions and trillions of dollars worth, would just evaporate overnight. And it would sort of have a snowball effect where you have one bank that is directly impacted by the US no longer paying it back. And then you also have a bank that it lends to that's all of a sudden been affected and that you don't realize until a week later. And it just turned into this really, really bad mess. I think it would probably put the Great Depression, it would make the Great Depression look very, very small. So, and because it is such a bad thing that that I really don't think it will happen, just because of the amount of treasuries in the world that rely on the Fed continuing to pay back its debt, or the federal government continue to pay back its debt, is just so enormous that it would make 2008 look like a walk in the park. So because it's so big, I just don't think the probability that the U.S. actually defaults on its debt is very high. I think it's probably more like 0.001% or something like that. I don't know the actual probability, but just how big of an impact it would make if it did default on its debt, that's probably not likely going to happen. So thanks guys for watching the video, and giving me a thumbs up and subscribe. See you next time.